Humanity is at the crossroads. Whether this will be our finest century ever or a disastrous one depends on the actions we take in the coming years. It could be a century of unparalleled development, where diseases are eradicated, where poverty is overcome, where many of the things that have afflicted us since we came out of Africa 200,000 years ago are mastered. But it could also be, in Martin Rees's words, Lord Rees, our final century, a century in which disaster on a scale never known to mankind afflicts us all. The outcome will depend on actions and thinking that we undertake in the coming years. And what I'd like to suggest to you in the coming hour is that the issues ahead of us require all of our concentrated attention. We cannot predict the future. The best minds in the best institutions get it wrong. This is the case in technology, it is the case in politics, and it is the case in all aspects of society, and certainly in finance. It is not because MI5 and MI6 and Prime Minister Thatcher were not smart, or that they did not have information systems at their disposal, that they did not understand what was happening in South Africa, my homeland. It is not because the leaders of IBM didn't have the best systems, that they didn't know what was happening on computing. And it's not because the pundits don't follow the polls, that they don't know what will happen in the years to come. And of course, we know that the best of the institutions, the financial institutions, the central banks, the International Monetary Fund, the Bank for International Settlements, the Financial Stability Forum, these are the elite of global governance. And yet this elite system, which is far better than any of the other global surveillance systems, which was designed in order to create financial stability, which was designed in order to look into the future and provide the stability the world so urgently needs on finance. These institutions didn't even see the financial crisis coming. Over 20,000 economists whose job it is to understand the financial system didn't see it coming. And of course, the economics profession, the orthodoxy, didn't. So we cannot rely on our institutions, and we cannot rely on the theories to tell us what the future will bring. What can we do? We can try and understand the major structural shifts, and we can develop a resilience and an ability to understand the complexity of the world and how it's changing as we go forward. The most important thing is to understand this extraordinary period we live in humanity. This is a period unlike any in the history of civilization. And why do I say this? I say this because the lives that we have lived, our lives, this period of history, is a period where things have happened at a pace and scale not known before. I'm humbled standing in this place, knowing that I'm standing where Faraday did, where the Curies stood, where 17 Nobel Prize winners have presented. There have been huge developments in history, not least here in the Royal Institution. But none of them, in terms of pace and scale, come near the changes that are happening in our lifetimes. The past 30 years or so, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, since the opening up of China, since the ending of dictatorships in Latin America, in Africa and Asia, since the coming together of Europe with the Maastricht Treaty, since the development of fiber optics, since the development of containerization and many other exponential growths in technology, as well as political changes at a pace and scale unknown before, have brought the world together in a much more integrated and complex fashion ever before, never seen before. And this coming together, this globalization, this tidal wave of globalization in this period has brought with it unparalleled benefits. Income per capita has grown more rapidly than in the history. And it's this coming together, as it did 1,000 years ago when Islamic and Christian civilizations came together, when people came together, ideas leapfrogged. It's this what economists call endogenous growth. It's the coming of ideas that come from new technologies, from the breaking down of the Berlin Wall, from the ending of isolation. It's the ability of people to connect in ways that were unforeseen and to leapfrog history that is so exciting. It is this that has led to this most remarkable period in humanity. It's been a period where life expectancy at birth has increased by about 20 years. And it took about from the Stone Age to achieve an average life expectancy improvement of that level. Illiteracy in the world has gone down by about a half, from about 50% to about 25%. And the number of people living under $1 a day, which is an extraordinarily crude but important measure of development, has gone down by about 300 million, despite, and this is the important fact, the world's population increasing by about 2 billion over this time. So it's a remarkable time. And you can take virtually any indicator you look at and see something very different to history. Of course, the key question is, will this continue? Is this sustainable? What are the underbelly or consequences of globalization? And I would like to suggest that these are severe, and that these bring into question the very benefits that globalization has brought. And so what we need to understand going forward is how we harvest the benefits of this coming together of people and how we mitigate the downside risks. Now, one of the downside risks, of course, is growing inequality, because not everyone has benefited from this. The bottom billion have suffered in this process, and we can discuss afterwards to what extent it's the result or despite globalization. But not everyone has benefited, and certainly some have become more vulnerable. When we look forward and try and understand how this is likely to evolve, the most important driver is perhaps demography. The uncertainty around demography is extraordinary. It's a range of close to 4 billion people over simply the next 40 years in terms of this range of UN projections. I believe we'll be closer to the bottom, around 9 billion people. But the reason why there's so much uncertainty is because we really don't understand some of the key drivers. What will life expectancy be on the one hand, and what's fertility likely to develop at on the other? Life expectancy is a remarkable story, not least in recent years. These are conservative estimates from our Institute of Aging in Oxford in the 21st Century School. And they show a number of things. They show this convergence around the world. Of course, there are major exceptions, not least in southern Africa, where life expectancy has gone down by over 20 years in the last 20 years, due to HIV/AIDS principally. But the rest of the world has enjoyed a most remarkable improvement in life expectancy, which is a long phenomenon, as many of you will know. This is likely to accelerate, I think, for the reasons which I'll outline. But there's a convergence and there's an increase of about 2 years per decade in life expectancy, even on the conservative projections. It's one of the great benefits of tonight, apart from, I hope, giving you some mind food, is that your life expectancy will increase by a couple of minutes as you stay here. Now, what we really don't understand is fertility. And that's because the changes in fertility have been so dramatic. So parents who have 7 kids with their kids having 1 or 2 is a very common phenomenon. The remarkable thing here is that the most dramatic changes are in the emerging markets. So, for example, Taiwan has gone from 7 to under 1 in 1 generation. People living in Shanghai have gone down to under 1 child per woman or per family. Similarly in Hong Kong, similarly in Korea, and in many other countries around the world. So this rapid decline in fertility, it's a global phenomenon. Only Africa is likely to have above replacement level in this period that we're looking at, up to about 2050. And even that is most probably incorrect in that fertility will decline more rapidly. So the world's population is aging dramatically, and with this are many, many consequences. This is a global phenomenon, as I indicated, and it leads to many economic imperatives, health system imperatives, and, of course, their gender imbalances. So we see with Italy the movement from what was our traditional thinking around a population pyramid towards what some would think of as a population coffin, or for the aesthetically minded, perhaps you see this as a beautiful vase. This is, of course, an enormous burden on the youth. How will these people in these bottom cohorts support the elderly? What can the elderly look forward to in terms of pensions, in terms of retirement, in terms of healthcare systems? Who will push us around in our wheelchairs when we get up there? Is the sort of question we would need to ask. And of course, this is not sustainable in terms of current expectations. So I would imagine that our concept of retirement, our concepts of entitlements on pensions will disappear in the years to come when you see how these demographics play through. It's very difficult to imagine how it will continue to be sustained. And of course, our concept of education will have to change with it. It's not much point having a university degree in your 20s and then find 60 years later you still need to know what's going on in the world. So we'll need continual education and re-education, learning as the world evolves rapidly with us. And as I indicated, this is a global phenomenon. So in China, there's most remarkable changes going to what some have called a skyscraper structure, with very similar numbers of people in terms of share of the population and absolute numbers in the medium term at each cohort, with a little peak at the top like you would get on a skyscraper. Again, major gender imbalances at certain cohorts. There are provinces in China with 1.3 boys to every girl at the age of 5. This clearly, as you play it through, leads to a vicious circle where fertility declines even more rapidly, but also all sorts of other issues. And one of the key questions as one progresses forward is how do you create societies which are non-sexist, where having a girl is as valuable to a family if you're only going to have one child as a boy, that it will provide you the same support in your old age, that will have the same potential in life. And creating non-sexist societies and gender equality is a vital dimension in preparing resilience for the future. A question, of course, is can migration make up some of this deficit? And I would like to suggest that migration is extremely important. Migration is important primarily because I believe migration brings ideas, the reasons I started with. Migration is a very important part of the benefits of globalization. It's the reason, and one of the key reasons, why we've had such vibrant economies over the last 30 years, is because levels of migration have increased, not least in Europe. But can migration meet these shortfalls that I've indicated coming out of the demography? This is very unlikely. As you see here, the rich country labor force is projected to decline by about 200 million over this period, from about 800 million to 600 million. This is an enormous decline. The scale of migration that would be necessary to meet this sort of deficit is perhaps 5 to 10 times the current levels of migration. It's unlikely to be politically sustainable. But even more deeply, it's unlikely to be provided. Where will these migrants come from? Because the countries which are sending migrants are going through an even more rapid demographic transition and economic transition than the countries that are receiving them. So migration is vital. Migration is a source of ideas. It can make certain skills deficits be overcome in the short term, but it's certainly not going to be a panacea, and it's certainly not going to provide all the solutions we know. Equally, in the future, we'll not only be thinking about the war on talent increasingly, or how to get skilled people, and many of the bright people want to go to China and Shanghai, but also unskilled. It's back to this question of who's going to be servicing us in our old age, when there are great shortages of labor. So a war on both talent, but also a competition for unskilled people. And it's very difficult in this environment of 10% unemployment to suggest that actually this is a temporary phenomenon. But I do believe that the issue of the coming decades, out into the 2020s and 30s, is increasingly likely to be population shortages, not too many people, and not only in Europe, but around the world. Now, the big issue in Asia is, of course, the elderly. And when you look at the scales here, it's extraordinary to what extent Asia overwhelms in virtually every area. But the number of people over 65 is likely to reach about 700 million in Asia by 2025, not very far away. The growth rate is rapid everywhere, not least in Europe, but the sheer numbers in Asia are overwhelming compared to elsewhere. And of course, this is going to lead to major structural changes in their labor market. So the good news for those of us that are getting older is that I think we're going to be more valued and have jobs in the future for as long as we want them. And certainly we'll need them because we'll need to pay for our own retirements and pensions. Now, behind a lot of this is assumptions regarding economic growth going forward. These are numbers that were generated at the World Bank before I left it. And what you see here is what really in many respects looks like the flip side of the past 30 years. And these are rather sanguine numbers. they suggest that growth is likely to continue, and many of the phenomenon that we've seen in growth over the last decades is likely to be sustained. In particular, the emerging markets being the engine of global growth is likely to be sustained. And you see the averages for the developing countries are much higher than the averages for the rich countries. The rich countries will have tepid growth, 1, 2, maybe 3% if they're very lucky over this period. Whereas countries in Asia, particularly China and India, will grow at perhaps as much as 10%. Now, 10% is a remarkable number in terms of growth. Firstly, it's never been achieved on a sustained period in the history of humanity, and that's again a reason why I noted at the beginning I think this is a very extraordinary time. But secondly, at that rate, you double your income every 7 or 8 years. That is an amazing phenomenon, and that means, of course, in China over the last 30, 40 years, incomes have quadrupled. And that is a global driver of many things. But similar things are happening in other countries. It's something we've never experienced in the rich countries, this rate of growth and what it does to your society and, of course, what it does to markets. But it's very important. And the assumption that it's sustainable is important. I think it is, and I'm very happy to discuss the reasons for that. But a lot has to do with technology catch-up and the flow of ideas. It's the same point, that what drives growth and what drives progress is the flow of ideas. And, of course, being in the Royal Institution, which is all about ideas, I think it's easy to understand why these become so important. Now, at this rate, China rapidly becomes the biggest economy in the world. Depending on what your assumptions are regarding the Chinese growth rate, it overtakes the US in the period from around 2030 to 2050. And I think it's likely to be around the earlier period, around 2030. Of course, the center of gravity of the world, as India similarly is growing, moves towards Asia over this period. And in politics, this will have very significant implications. Let me move now from talking about some of the global trends to talking about some of the technologies. And again, being here in the Royal Institution, this is a place where many of this was invented. The pace of change, though, of the coming years, I believe, will be greater than even people like Faraday and the Curies expected. And the unexpected consequences, equally so. A whole variety of areas, and I think it's going to be in the health areas, perhaps, where there's going to be the most radical changes, the ones that will surprise us and lead to very deep and difficult questions. Behind a lot of this innovation is Moore's law, is the ability of microprocessors to be more effective for the same price. This is a remarkable phenomenon. So, my mobile phone, for example, is more powerful than the entire Apollo space program. My kids' PlayStation 3 is more powerful than Deep Blue, the computer that beat Kasparov 10 years ago. And as this goes forward, it will continue to outpace this. If you go down Tottenham Court Road, you can now buy 1,000 gigabytes, a terabyte, for under £100. This is quite extraordinary, given that the entire computing power in the UK was less than that about 30 years ago. What you get for the same price is speed and power. And so, if this is going to continue, and the people working in quantum computing and advanced computing in Oxford have convinced me that it will for at least the next 20 years, we're going to get to problems with etching at the molecular level, and there's all sorts of potential solutions to that, including quantum computing. But if this continues, one has to begin to imagine where it permeates. Will we be able to mimic the brain, as this graphic suggests? I think Baroness Greenfield would be amongst those that say it's unlikely, because we really don't have a handle on the brain. Although there are those, like Ray Kurzweil, that think we will, by perhaps a little bit further out than this period. But we might not be able to mimic the brain, but we'll be able to do extraordinarily powerful things. And so it's this Moore's law, this exponential growth at the same, so you get more and more at the same price, that will drive a lot of technological development and create opportunities that we cannot imagine. One of them, which is all over our lives, is, of course, the information Big Bang. And what's so remarkable to me about this is the spread of ideas that come with it. The ability of a poor child in Soweto or in Sao Paulo to have the same information at their disposal as I have. Of course, they don't have the education, they don't have the cognitive systems or the language to understand it, but it's a remarkably powerful thing. This is growing exponentially too because of this power of microcomputing or microprocessors. And so what you have here is this extraordinary story where we are now every year adding more information onto the web than has been ever put on it before, but has ever been written or said before in the history of humanity. All the books in all the libraries are now being added at least every year. And because this is growing exponentially, in about 2 or 3 years' time, it will be every month that more information is added onto the web than in the history of humanity. And one runs this through, and if there are no constraints, it becomes even more powerful. Of course, the question is, what do we do with this? How is this made useful, other than playing with Facebook or Twitter? How can this be used for the services of mankind and humanity? Another development of the future is this miniaturization, and this is a mock-up of a dust mite on a nano cog. But nano is there. This is a nano process which is happening at a billionth of a second, at a billionth of a meter in size or scale, a little bit more, maybe 10 nanometers, of a nano syringe that we're developing at Oxford going through a cell membrane. We don't really understand many of the close dynamics of this, as you'll see from the video and from the pictures, what these particles that stick to the nano syringes are. But they are being developed, and they are in fact in use. You can get them on the high street in certain products, nano products. So they're already commercialized. Will this be, as has been discovered here, I think on this table, was radioactive for 18 years or something after the Curies did their inventions here? Will this be something we don't understand? What will be the potential of this? How do we work with nanomachines in our bodies, in the air, invisible, but effective in doing many things, amongst the revolutions of the coming years? Another extraordinary revolution is going to be that related to stem cell. The ability to create any part of the body by creating embryonic stem cells, directing them, is absolutely revolutionary. This is a cardiac stem cell that we've developed in Oxford, and people are beginning to develop other cell types. What is revolutionary at the moment is the ability to create these not only out of embryo, which brings with it not only ethical concerns, but also brings with it concerns regarding rejection and many other sorts of problems, is the ability to create stem cells out of your own skin. So using your own skill to create a stem cell, and this has been done already. Of course, this is science in its infancy, but this will be commercialized over the coming decades and lead to completely different ways of thinking about regenerative medicine. The ability to build any part of the body, and we're working with this company Geron in California on trying to rebuild a spinal column. This is, for many, a miracle of medicine, which will lead to changes in the way that we understand the potential. Perhaps even stranger and more powerful is the dynamics around genetics. This is a genetically modified mouse in front, with exactly the same characteristics as the wild mice behind it. The difference is that it goes for 6 hours, whereas the wild mouse goes for about 20 minutes. It goes 6 kilometers, whereas the wild mouse goes for about 200 meters. It can reproduce to the human equivalent of 85. And of course, it consumes a bit more food, about 60% more food. But then again, we all consume too much food. So that's not really a binding constraint on genetics. Where does this lead? What will an Olympics look like in 2040 or 2050? Will scientists be racing their genetically modified people? Will we be able to count it? How will a university like Oxford decide on its entrance qualifications? What enhancement will we allow? What won't we? Will we make it equitable by giving everyone the same chemicals? These are very, very difficult questions. They raise profound moral and ethical dilemmas. They are things that we are only beginning to get a hint of, but they will change the way the future looks, and they'll change the nature of equality and inequality and medicine and healthcare. A difficulty with this is that although one might just want to reject it and say enhancement is a bad thing, let's keep the door closed, is not only that scientists generally say we don't like that sort of argument. If it can be explored, we will explore it, and that's why we're here, but also because these things can bring huge benefits. We know from studies on the impact of lead, for example, on cognition, people living near highways and heavily affected by lead pollution compared to people in the same schools, in the same council estates or whatever, who live a little bit further away and didn't have that, about some of the social consequences from very small improvements in cognition. Very small improvements in the ability of people to do things, ranging from a tax return to simple tasks. A lot of these people are heavy drains on society when they're down at this end of what crudely is known as the IQ bell. If you can move, particularly people who are dysfunctional at this end, a little bit along, you might have huge social improvement rates, as these studies that have been done with people who've suffered cognitive disadvantages show. But it's a moral maze. It's an ethical maze. And of course, it's a maze that is also about money. Who's going to pay? And will this be available only to the super rich? It also is not clear that anything we do in terms of enhancement is going to make us any wiser. So we'll move from being able to do facelifts to be able to lift our brains, to be able to concentrate more, to be able to perhaps be more intelligent. Would we want people trying to solve the climate change problem to be enhanced or not? Perhaps. But who is going to decide? And will this allow better lives for everyone, or are we moving to new eugenics? Are we moving to a situation where the wealthy or people in very wealthy countries, like, say, Switzerland, might be improved, and those that are left with the UK NHS, or worse still, the Rwanda health system, will find that they don't have it available to them unless they're very wealthy? These will be very difficult discussions. They're discussions that have to happen not only in one jurisdiction like the UK, but globally as well, because these things have to be sorted in a global way. Now, one of the things as we go forward that we're going to have to become much better at managing is the global risks. The level of natural risk in the world hasn't really changed in recent decades, although the impact has, because we have many more people and the people have many more assets, houses and wealth. But what has changed is anthropogenic risk, what we do to ourselves, how we are messing up our planet. And the ones we really worry most about in Oxford are those in the top right-hand quadrant here, the ones that will lead to very, very severe damages to the whole of society. I used to worry about that one, and I've sort of graduated up there through academia. These are the things that can change the face of humanity. These are the things that Lord Rees calls those that would make this our final century. We need to keep reminding ourselves of our vulnerability. We are so arrogant about our place because we've been so successful, not least over the last 30 years. But of course, we know that existential risk is real for most species. We know that we are very fortunate to be here because of the experiences of 75,000 years ago. And we know that there are many others coming around. What are the things that I worry most about going forward? Well, clearly, climate change is on all of our minds. And concentrations of carbon dioxide and other gases are clearly increasing. I still meet people that don't believe that this is anthropogenic. I think they should come and speak to some of the scientists in Oxford. Where are we likely to end up on this? I'm a pessimist because I think even the scale of the actions being now contemplated for Copenhagen, which are strong by some of the parties, are unlikely to lead to enough action quick enough, particularly around the world, to be able to mitigate this hazard. So we're heading towards at least 2 and maybe 4 or 5 degrees average temperature increases over this century. What does that average mean? It means that some places will be a lot colder and some places will be 15 or 20 degrees average temperature hotter. And what's behind that, of course, is all sorts of other climatic changes, weather changes, precipitation, wind, fertility of soils, and everything else that goes with it. We don't understand the detail of where and what. So there's a lot of fuzziness in the science and it's becoming more and more detailed, and the power of computing is helping that. But what we really don't understand is tipping points. Will the ice sheet slip into the ocean? What the implications of that? What the role of certain different factors are? Will the North Atlantic conveyor stop or not? These are unknowns at this stage. But we do know that there's a very, very high risk. And so what I would say to the climate skeptics is that's fine. You may well be right. But if there's a 5% chance even that there's climate change, let's make darn sure that we do everything we can to stop it happening. And I think there's a much higher chance. I think it's 99%. But because one's a climate skeptic doesn't mean one shouldn't take action now. We all don't believe our houses will burn down, but we will do a lot to stop that happening and get insurance and pay some money for that. The sea level rise, of course, will be very significant for many, much less significant than the other things, but there are parts of the world, not least the Maldives and parts of Bangladesh, where up to 40, 50 million people will be inundated. The question is, what can we do? How do we begin to mitigate this? Now, in the UK, we're already well over 10 tons of carbon per capita per year, and many countries are higher. So the question is, how do we get down to 2 tons of carbon per capita per year? What do we need to do in our lifestyles, in our technologies, to make this possible? And this is very difficult because our embedded systems, everything we do, has this historical legacy and dependence on carbon. So the office I sit in, for example, in Oxford, I think is producing about 1 ton of carbon per year, just my office, and home much more. How do you change this? How do you change our energy systems? You see this tremendous growth in renewables in the UK, but still very small, even if it doubles every year for the next 10 years, which it cannot for various reasons. So a key question in all of our lives is how do we begin to affect this? And how do we show leadership from the rich countries that is credible and provide enough financing to the poor countries to enable them to do things? And how do we accelerate the technologies of carbon capture and storage, the technologies around new energy sources, the technologies around geoengineering to begin to mitigate this impact? And how do we begin to think of the development challenges? Most people in developing countries need much more power. They are at the bottom of a growth curve of energy consumption. Their livelihoods, their education, their well-being depends on more power. And of course, this is not only about energy and electricity, it's also about transport. We cannot say to people, sorry, you're going to be stuck walking for the rest of your lives and your children will be, because we have put the stock of carbon up in the atmosphere. So we need to develop very rapidly new technologies, and we need to multiply by at least a factor of 15 times the efficiency of transport. This is doable. We are developing a car in Oxford that can do 5,500 miles per gallon. That will be enough to remedy this if everyone went to it. But there are technological constraints. It's still only good for a 10-year-old. Speeding this up, accelerating it, and then rolling it out is the big challenge. Geoengineering is fascinating. The potential to do things is there. We don't understand it yet. But the options are beginning to become evident. They raise many, many, many big questions. Economic questions, ethical questions, global law questions, global governance questions, and of course scientific questions like will this work and what will it do? This is an example of one such possibility. This is an iron filing drop into the ocean, a test off the back of a barge. Well, we know that large parts of the oceans are dead. We also know that large part, because of lack of iron, we also know that that the oceans absorb 40% of carbon and could absorb a lot more. How would we increase the carbon absorption of the oceans? Is this doable? Is it ethical? Who will decide? This is the sort of question that we're beginning to look at. It has big potential, but of course, there's major risk. There's also a whole question of ocean alkalinity and whether we can reverse that by, for example, scraping limestone, which is exposed within the oceans. Who's going to take responsibility for this? So climate change is a looming and rapidly growing tsunami. What we need to appreciate, though, is that we can't take our eye off other balls as we put our eye on that one. We need to remember that pandemics, that plagues, have always been and are likely to remain the biggest killers of humanity. Because of this very complexity and integration that has been the success of globalization, we have an underbelly which is vulnerability. The speed of transmission of problems is much greater. Systemic risk is much greater. Climate change is one side effect of the success of growth. More rapid transmission of pandemics will be another. There are those that believe that we're less vulnerable because we've developed antibiotics, we've developed information systems, we've developed ways of coping. I don't think so. I think that we will find that these will continue to shock us in that the way they have in the past. These diseases have killed over 10 times the number of people that wars have killed. What can we do? We need to aggressively push out our understanding of contagious diseases and new emerging diseases. And we need to understand how we distribute these and think about the ethical and other dimensions of this. This is work we've done with the UK government on Tamiflu and other drugs, which are now dealing with, of course, the swine flu that we have with us. It's very important that we think about these things before, like the UK government has. It makes dramatic impact on the outcomes. So we've always worried about these, as we see from our history books. We need to worry about new ones too. Perhaps the scariest of the new groups of pandemics will be those that we create ourselves, either deliberately or through accident. The potential to create a DNA synthesizer and to get off the web smallpox or Ebola and cook it in a clean room that costs not very much is growing by the minute. It doesn't only take a terrorist mind to do this. It can take a crazy person. We're a global village, and in every village there are village idiots. These village idiots are getting tools which are unimaginable in history. And so one of the other dramatic changes of this time we live in is the power of an individual for the first time to do something which will bring down very large parts of humanity. It's only been nation states up to this time. Now it's individuals. An individual in London could bring down the southeast of England, particularly through bioterrorism. But as I indicate, we need to ensure that we don't only think about this as a terrorist hazard, but also as a hazard which includes everyone. So inclusive globalization requires that citizens don't have the will to destroy large parts of humanity. The old forms of conflict will continue. There's no change in many of these. Indeed, many of them have gone down dramatically. There are far less wars between countries, and within countries, there's less conflict. That is a decreasing hazard, although, of course, it's still very significant, and there's still some terrifying hotspots in this. What's remarkable as well is this resurgence of piracy. Who would imagine we'd be talking about piracy in 2009? But that's a piracy, it's a new ability of individual actors to get beyond and through the global governance structure, to use the tools like mobile phones, like the internet, like high-speed speedboats. We use the tools that otherwise were developed for completely different purposes, to undermine globalization, to make us more vulnerable. And it's this vulnerability which needs to be understood. We need to think about how these different forces of risk, which threaten the success of globalization, are likely to play out. And we need to take a lesson from the financial crisis in understanding how surprising these can be and how the best institutions aren't able to manage them. We need to understand the linkages between these different elements, how something happening in one place can move around the world and have a very different outcome. The bankers lending in the south of the US to poor people didn't think that they would be affecting a poor pensioner in Finland, but they have. They've made her bankrupt. It's that interconnectivity in new ways that is not understood. And it's also getting out of disciplinary boundaries. We've been so focused in our professional lives on thinking about one issue. How do we develop a thinking which is interdisciplinary, that addresses problems in new ways, that begins to think about relationships? And that's not the weakening of any discipline, because we need a much deeper understanding, but it's also joining some of the dots and having the capacity to do it. The biggest challenge in all of this is that there's no one at the wheel. The institutions we have with responsibility for the world are institutions which are fossilized, which were created out of previous crises for different means. And so that we have this situation where even the best equipped of them, and those of you that know these institutions will know that the International Monetary Fund is the best equipped in terms of the level of its personnel, its execution ability, and its capacity. Even the best equipped of them was totally redundant when the crisis came. We need to learn from that. What do you do with these institutions? Do you throw them out? Do you try and transform them? Do you create new ones? How would you do that? These are important questions that we need to address. And they're questions, I think, that will determine in many ways the outcomes. Are we only going to have institutions that emerge ex post, after a crisis, out of the ashes? Or are we wise enough? Have we learned enough from our histories and from our understanding of the world to do something different? Are we prepared to give up some of the G8 dominance to create a more global community? And what would it look like? And will it have executive power? If you have a global policeman and the policeman blows the red card, will all the players listen? One of the stories about the IMF, why it was so unsuccessful in stopping the financial crisis, although based in Washington and the US being the largest shareholder with 17% of the vote, the US never listened, in fact barely knew that the IMF was doing surveillance of it. It thought it was beyond it. And so when the IMF called the shots and said there was a real risk, the US simply ignored it. It's that problem. Can you stop either the big powers or even the small mavericks like the North Koreas from just disregarding the rules? How do we get a legitimate, accountable, effective global institution? Are we any more able to manage ourselves as a global community than we were in primitive times? Have we seen evolution? How can we do it? And how do we learn from the private sector? Private sector firms are pretty good at operating in 150 countries in real time across cultures using new technologies. The public sector has been much less so. It's important as we think about this also to think about the role of research and science. These are just 3 snapshots of the sorts of focus that there is on media, on engines that pick up research papers in different areas. So Google Scholar, Scopus, and the Web of Knowledge. And what you see here is a sort of rather startling picture, which is there's maybe 50 times more research on the dung beetle than there is on the future of the planet. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with studying dung beetles. It's just we don't seem to have the necessary focus on the real things. And it's a strange thing, because all of course, the rest of our lives will be spent in the future. Half of the children being born in the UK this year are expected to live beyond 100. And yet how much effort is going in to prepare ourselves, them, and the world for that future? And given the risk of extinction, which I think Martin Rees is rather pessimistic on his 50%, but let's say it's 5%, given the risk, shouldn't we be spending a lot more work on this? So this is a very important element in it. If we want to prepare a better future, we need better governance on the one hand, and we need much more thinking. It's not surprising that there's such a lack of preparedness because of this. Now, I did say that even the best minds with the best institutions can't get the future right. And so one needs to think about, how do you think about the future? I'm not a great believer in, for example, scenario planning and some of this traditional way of thinking of the future. But getting people to think in new ways, getting people to join up, I think yields enormous opportunity. And working out ways in which we can get the global leadership to begin to cooperate is important. We face this choice. We face this choice of, on the one hand, a world which will rather anarchically play out, a world in which, for many, life is likely to be much better, but that, as we've seen, the systemic risks are growing. And so that even the best protected people in the best protected countries are unlikely to be able to insulate themselves from the dramatic forces of globalization. What globalization has done has meant that the nodes of connectivity are growing exponentially. And so that on any dimension you virtually look at, this is important. Management theory has made this even more dangerous. Management theory over the last 20 years has encouraged companies to value all their assets, including their stocks, as something which needs to be, in the words which are commonly used, sweat your assets. This is true in banking, where holding capital on your balance sheet was regarded as a wasted opportunity. It needed to be leveraged, and so, of course, people leveraged these things up 50,000 times. And it's also true in other areas. How many days oxygen supply in the UK hospitals, and how are they valued? How many days food supply? How many days energy supply? How many days drug supplies? How many days water supply do we hold as stocks? And when you look across the board, in virtually all societies around the world, the way that accountancy practice has moved has meant that these are regarded as a liability. One of the ways we can help insulate ourselves from these risks is by regarding some of these things as an asset, as a valuable tool which will help build resilience. And so when you have a stock, it may be a good thing. And that's, of course, what a lot of the capital adequacy discussions in banking are about. How much stock holding should you have of capital? But the other thing that we learned from the financial crisis is that simply having rules is not enough around this. The banking system is full of rules, as many of you that work in it will know. The other phenomenon is that kids like this, when they go to good universities and get ideas, will outgame us. The capacity of innovation, of what in finance is called regulatory arbitrage, the capacity to innovate will always outfox us. How do you have a system of surveillance where people either malevolently, because they want to kill you or they want to game you for some reason, or benevolently, because they just want to make some money and the rules allow it, how do you stop a system like that overwhelming you? How do you ensure that a regulator of a system is smarter than those that it regulates? In many respects, this is a generational challenge. What we find, for example, is that the brightest maths and physics graduates, thankfully a little bit less after the financial crisis, go into the city rather than going into maths and physics. And they go into the city and they work in banks where no one really understands what they're doing, but they're developing what Warren Buffett has called weapons of mass destruction. And these were not understood by their bosses, they were not understood by the regulators, but they were legal and they were making a lot of money out of leverage. So what does one do in that environment? Do you stop innovation? Do you leave the value that they create, and they were basically trying to slice and dice risk across the system? Do you leave that on the table? Do you say to these kids, sorry, innovation is banned? Do we say that in the sciences, where we don't know the consequences of some of the things we're doing it, and do we say it in finance? My sense is that we cannot say that there will continue to be innovation. But we need to ensure that the kids and the people, I say kids, 20-year-olds, 23-year-olds developing new technologies, that they also come into the regulatory environment. So that there's a generational mix, that there's a mix of skills from different sectors, and that governments and public sector and those that care about the public good are informed by those that are motivated by themselves. A lot of what has happened is this divorce between public and private. The choice for a child like this, or a young adult, is, of course, what to do, but then also how do you externalize it? How do you know what the consequences of what you're doing is for society? This is the extraordinarily difficult thing. And what we saw in the financial crisis and what we're seeing in many other areas is unintended consequences. Goodwill leading to bad outcomes. And that's because we didn't understand the summing up. We didn't understand this basic phenomenon, which is the growing complexity of the world. That globalization has brought us much closer, and the system is therefore much more vulnerable. It's a huge benefit. It's a benefit which I believe is going to lead to the best century ever. It's a benefit which, in many respects, we can harness, which already has led to progress over our lifetimes, which I've indicated has been at a rate unknown in the history of mankind. But it is also something which will not automatically come to us. And so if we want a future of what we may call eco-affluence, a future where we can live the lives that we strive for, be it because we love listening to music, or we love playing a sport, or we love eating good food, we can do that to our heart's desire. But we can do it without damaging the planet. And we can do it in a way that will lead to a beneficial outcome, not only for ourselves as we consume this product, but for all those around it. And so this concept of eco-affluence, or of creating a well-being which is shared by all, is absolutely critical to the way that we begin to think about the future. It's vital that we, when we're doing things, think about the general good. If we want to have an old age where we are not only cloned like these women, but also happy and creating music, then it's important that we understand the options. These are options which are extraordinarily complex. And what we're doing in the 21st century school in Oxford is trying to think through a number of them. Baroness Greenfield, we are very fortunate to have as the head of this one, the Institute on the Future of the Mind. This is a group working on the problems of aging, of Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, dementia, as well as the young mind. And I'm sure you'll know of her extraordinary work in this area. But we're working across a very wide range of other areas. This group is working on how to take carbon out of transport. So the car I showed you that does over 3,000 miles per gallon being developed by this group. All of them are interdisciplinary. So this is engineers, it's sociologists, it's transport specialists, and many others. It's also working on smart metering, the potential to understand as we approach our homes or when we're sitting here on our iPhones or whatever, what's working in home, to turn it off, to turn it down, to know what's happening in terms of energy consumption is absolutely vital. The Environmental Change Institute works on a very broad range of areas, including on tropical forests, and we have stations in the Amazon, in Africa, and in Indonesia. Understanding the detail of the carbon cycle around tropical forests, also trying to understand the tipping points. As they become drier, the forests are likely to burn. As they burn, there'll be much less resilience to future lightning strikes, and they could well tip quicker. What does one do about it? Energy Materials is developing new energy sources, very wide range of things being looked at, from solar and wind to nuclear. Oceans is a fascinating interdisciplinary group as well, bringing together ocean scientists, chemists, physicists, earth scientists, trying to understand the detail. The acidification of the ocean is one of the most disturbing elements that's going on. Small crustaceans, shell formation, is being retarded already. And if you put them in a bowl, you put a slight increase in the acidity level, you see how the whole food chain is likely to be disturbed. But they're also looking at some of the possible solutions. I mentioned the potential for scraping limestone or dropping lime into the ocean. I mentioned, too, the potential for fertilization. That's not because we believe these things should happen at all. We believe that if we don't understand them in an interdisciplinary way, if we don't bring great lawyers, ethicists, and others into these debates, others are likely to drive them and perhaps drive them into the wrong ways. Emergent infection speaks for itself, and I've spoken about this. But like the other groups, it's an interdisciplinary group. So it's run by professors of zoology and clinical medicine, together with people from mathematics, from sociology, from anthropology, from public health, and from many other areas. Baroness Greenfield with the Future of the Mind, an extraordinary group. The nanoscience group is working on the development of nanobots, on nanoparticles that will be able to transmit drugs to different parts of the body, to be able to develop new therapies, but it's also working to try and understand, before these are commercialized or used, what the potential downside effects are. Nano is a very complex and poorly understood. And the potential for this to perhaps be a new asbestosis or to be a hazard is not well understood. So before we put these things in our body or in our products, we really do need to get a much bigger handle on it. And coming out of this group, out of so many others, is the question of regulatory authority. There's no one regulating these. And should they be, and how should they be? The ethics of the biosciences, I think you've had a presentation here before by Professor Julian Savulescu, who runs this, is this group that brings together the frontiers of medicine with the deep ethical questions and the regulatory questions. Who should decide about cloning? How do we begin to think about many of these areas? The cancer therapy group is working on cures for cancer which are different to many others, particularly run by a former person who ran the particle accelerator in CERN, developing new particle accelerators which can target individual groups of cells. If they get it right, it could be a miracle for those that have suffered from cancers, particularly in areas which are very vulnerable to the huge range of destruction that radiotherapy and normal chemotherapy bring. But the ability to target cells in the eyes or in the testicles, in the liver, in the brain, could bring different ways of treating cancer, which are extremely exciting. The stem cell group I talked briefly about, this is bringing together, the stem cell institute we've created is bringing together 25 different labs. The common problem in Oxford, as in many educational establishments, is the lack of joined-upness, that people just don't speak to each other and don't therefore become effective. So how do we bring people together and through that lead to a new impulse in their work? The migration group is, I think, the best in the world. About 40 people across the university working on migration, all aspects of it, brain drain to unskilled, and of course thinking about the policy consequences. I've indicated that I think migration is one of the big unknown subjects in terms of its benefits, but also the implications of policies now for the future. Armed conflict brings together people from law, from ethics and philosophy, trying to work out ways to stop conflict. It is, again, thinking about the ethical issues as well as the legal issues. Aging is a big group of people, demographers, sociologists, anthropologists, public health specialists, genetologists, and others. They're the ones that provided those sorts of graphics I've shown. They're looking at how aging is developing, its health implications, and the implications for society. Science Innovation Society is about the interaction of technology changes and social changes. A lot of the broad statements I've made about interaction are things they're concerned about. They also have a very strong team of people doing scenarios and future thinking, including the person that used to run the Shell program on scenarios. The Future of Humanities, our modestly named institute. It's also our smallest. It's 4 philosophers. It's a philosopher, an astrophysicist, an applied ethicist, and a cosmologist. So what are they doing? They are looking at these very big, long-term questions, the 50 to 100-year to 200-year questions, everything from meteor strikes to being taken over by smart computers. So those global catastrophic risks of a sort of way out Ray Kurzweil type are things that concern them. What they've taught me is many of those things are highlighted at the beginning, how vulnerable we are, how incredibly privileged we are to live in this time, a time that has brought us the best that humanity has known, the potential for change, the ability to come together, the ability to understand each other, to understand everyone on earth, to be able to travel, to be able to indulge in many of the things that our parents couldn't dream of, and the ability to give that to the next generation. But it's also a time of extraordinary vulnerability. It's a time when, unless we get this right, we could well be looked upon by the next generation as the most foolish in the history of humanity. Those that had it all and just didn't see it. Those that thought they were so smart and had the technologies of smartness, but proved themselves totally lacking in wisdom. Those that, although they had developed all the advances of the past and had the information systems which could call them up at the click of a finger, weren't able to see through them. And so as we begin to prepare for the future, we need to ask ourselves, how can we avoid this? How can we ensure that as we go forward, we're able to harvest all of this? How, standing in the Royal Institution, we're able to think about the absolutely extraordinary things that happened at this desk. Marie Curie wasn't allowed to sit here, stand at the desk. She sat where Baroness Greenfield is, while her husband in that sexist society did the presentations. We've come a long way. We've come a long way since the time of Faraday, almost 200 years ago, absolutely leapfrogging as he did in new ways. But we are perhaps more vulnerable. And so as we think about all of this and have the capacity to think about our pasts and our future, I hope you are convinced, like I am, that humanity is at the crossroads, and that unless we think differently, we will not create the better world that we all strive for. Thank you.